I still remember the sound of cutlery scraping against porcelain that night. It wasn't accidental, it was sharp, deliberate, and grating, the kind of sound that crawls under your skin. A knife dragged too hard against a plate. A fork set down without care. Small noises, yet unbearably loud in a room that was already tense. They echoed longer than they should have, as if the house itself was listening. "You're a loser," my stepson said casually. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look at me. His eyes stayed fixed on his plate, twirling pasta like the words meant nothing at all, like he was commenting on the weather. That was the cruelest part. The ease of it. The confidence. As if he had said it 100 times before in his head and finally decided to say it out loud. The dining table froze. Time seemed to hesitate, suspended between one breath and the next. My husband's fork stopped mid-air, a piece of food trembling at its tip before dropping back onto the plate. No one moved. No one spoke. The chandelier above us hummed softly, its warm light suddenly too bright, too exposed, illuminating every crack in the room and every unspoken truth between us. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows, whispering along the glass of the house I had cleaned room by room, maintained year after year, and sacrificed myself for, yet never truly owned. A house that knew my footsteps better than my name. A house where I belonged to everyone, but nothing truly belonged to me. I felt every eye flicker toward me, waiting. Waiting for anger. Waiting for tears. Waiting for me to defend myself. I said nothing. I lowered my gaze, folded my hands in my lap, and swallowed the words rising in my throat. I let the silence stretch, thick, uncomfortable, heavy enough to suffocate. It settled between us like an uninvited guest, refusing to leave. And in that moment, as they mistook my quiet for weakness, my restraint for surrender, something irreversible began. That silence wasn't defeat. It was the beginning of everything. People often mistake silence for weakness. They assume that a woman who listens more than she speaks must have nothing to say. That night my stepson, Evan, made the same assumption, and in doing so, he revealed how little he truly knew about me. I had learned silence the hard way. Through meetings where speaking up meant being interrupted. Through marriages where compromise slowly turned into erasure. Through years of understanding that power doesn't always announce itself. It waits. I was 43 years old, standing at an age where society had quietly decided my story was already written. Former career woman. Present-day homemaker. Invisible. That was the label they gave me. What they didn't see was the woman I used to be. Before this house. Before this marriage. Before becoming someone's stepmother. I had been a senior financial analyst in a world that didn't forgive mistakes. I had survived boardrooms where a single miscalculation could cost millions and a single careless word could end a career. I had learned how to read people before they spoke, how to hear what wasn't being said, and how to wait for the right moment to act. When I married Richard, I didn't quit my career overnight. I stepped back slowly, first temporarily, then permanently, because someone had to be available, someone had to be flexible, someone had to keep the household running while everyone else chased success outside its walls. That someone was me. Evan never saw the transition. To him, I had always been there, setting the table, remembering birthdays, smoothing over arguments, fixing what others broke. Consistency looks like nothing when you've never lived without it. He didn't know I was the one who helped him draft his first resume at the kitchen counter. He didn't know I practiced interview questions with him late into the night while Richard slept. He didn't know I reviewed his contracts, quietly flagging risks I was never thanked for. To Evan, I was simply the woman who no longer worked. And in his world, that made me expendable. What he never understood was this. I didn't lose my power when I became quiet. I learned how to sharpen it. A marriage doesn't collapse in one dramatic moment. It erodes, slowly, quietly, through small compromises that pile up until one person is standing firmly on solid ground while the other is balancing on shifting sand. Mine tilted so gradually that by the time I noticed, I was no longer sure when it had begun. Richard was not a cruel man. That truth complicated everything. He never raised his voice, never struck me, never openly disrespected me. Instead, he loved me in ways that were convenient, predictable, controlled, and comfortable for him. He believed that providing was the same as valuing, and that assumption allowed him to stop listening. When we first married, we were equals. Two professionals with demanding careers. Two incomes that met in the middle. Two opinions that carried weight at the table. We spoke the same language then: deadlines, risks, projections, long-term planning. We challenged each other. We debated. We respected each other's minds. That balance didn't shatter overnight. It thinned. Evan was still adjusting to life with a stepmother. The house needed more attention. Schedules conflicted. Someone had to be flexible, someone had to be available, someone had to soften the sharp edges of everyone else's ambitions. That someone was me. At first, stepping back from my career was framed as a pause. Just for a little while, Richard said. Until things stabilize. I believed him. Or maybe I believed in us. Months turned into years. My office became a spare room. My business suits were replaced with practical clothes. My calendar emptied of meetings and filled with obligations no one noticed because they were always done. As my absence from the industry grew, Richard's confidence grew with it. You probably wouldn't enjoy those conversations anymore, he'd say when colleagues came over. It's all changed since you left. The words were gentle, almost caring. But they carried an unspoken conclusion. You no longer belong there. And I watched him make decisions, financial, personal, future-shaping, without asking my opinion. Not because he didn't love me, but because he no longer saw me as someone whose judgment mattered. Evan noticed everything. He noticed how his father explained money to me as if I were learning it for the first time. He noticed how my silence went unchallenged. He noticed how easily I was excluded. Children learn power by watching who is heard and who is ignored. At dinners, conversations about investments, promotions, and market risks flowed around me like background noise. You wouldn't find this interesting, Evan would say, not unkindly, already turning away. Richard never corrected him. That was when something fundamental shifted. Not in anger. Not in tears. In clarity. I understood then that my role had been quietly rewritten. I was no longer a partner. I was support. Infrastructure. The steady foundation no one thanked because it never cracked. And still, I stayed. Not because I didn't see what was happening. Not because I lacked the strength to leave. But because I was paying attention. Because I was learning exactly how they measured worth. And because once you understand the rules of a system, you also understand how easily it can fall apart. The dinner was supposed to be a celebration. Evan's promotion. His latest victory. Another milestone in a life that had been carefully constructed to look impressive from the outside. Richard insisted we make it special. Expensive wine, imported cheese, candles that were never used on ordinary nights. The kind of dinner that looks good in photographs but feels rehearsed in real life. I set the table myself. Polished the silverware until it reflected the chandelier's light. Folded the napkins just the way Richard liked. Cooked Evan's favorite dish, even though he never thanked me for it anymore. I moved through the kitchen quietly, efficiently, like someone who had practiced being invisible. Guests arrived, Evan's colleagues, people with sharp smiles and louder laughter. They shook Richard's hand firmly. They barely glanced at me. "And you are?" one of them asked, already distracted. "His wife," I said. The conversation moved on. During dinner, the talk revolved around numbers, markets, influence. Evan held court at the head of the table, confident, relaxed, feeding off the admiration. He spoke about deals I recognized immediately, strategies I had once taught, risks I could already see forming. No one asked what I thought. Halfway through the meal, Evan leaned back in his chair, swirling wine in his glass. His voice carried easily over the table. "Honestly," he said with a small laugh, It must be terrifying to wake up every day knowing you don't contribute anything real anymore. A few guests chuckled, uncertain whether it was a joke. My hands stilled in my lap. I looked at Richard. He hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long. Encouraged, Evan continued. No ambition. No relevance, he said casually. Then, without even looking at me, he delivered the words that would fracture everything. You're a loser. The room went silent. Forks froze mid-air. Glasses hovered inches from lips. Someone cleared their throat, then thought better of it. Even the guests seemed to realize they had crossed into something deeply personal. Richard finally spoke. Evan. I raised my hand. It's fine, I said softly. Evan smiled, relieved, victorious. To him, my calm confirmed everything he believed about me. The chandelier hummed above us. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows of the house I had poured years of myself into. I felt something settle deep inside me, not anger, not humiliation, but a sudden, unmistakable clarity. They were waiting for me to react. Instead, I stayed silent. And in that silence, as the dinner resumed awkwardly and the wine kept flowing, a line was crossed, one that could never be uncrossed. That night didn't end with raised voices or slammed doors. It ended with a decision. That night, after the guests left and the house finally exhaled, I did not cry. I washed the dishes. I wiped the counters. I folded the napkins Evan had mocked earlier without realizing it. I moved through the rooms with mechanical calm, responding when spoken to, offering nothing more than necessary. Richard asked if I was okay. I'm fine, I said. And for the first time, it wasn't a lie. When the house fell asleep, I stayed awake. I sat alone at the dining table long after the candles had burned out, listening to the refrigerator hum, replaying the evening in precise detail. Not emotionally, strategically. Every word Evan had said. Every reaction. Every hesitation. Anger is loud. It rushes. It makes mistakes. I had learned long ago that real power moves quietly. I opened my old laptop. The one I hadn't touched in years. The one Richard assumed held nothing more than photos and forgotten documents. The screen flickered as it came to life, familiar in a way that felt like muscle memory returning. I didn't rush. I updated the operating system. Installed security patches. Restored encrypted folders I had archived when I stepped away from my career. Each action was deliberate, methodical, comfortingly precise. This wasn't revenge yet. This was reconnaissance. I began with what was public. Linked profiles. Corporate press releases. Evan's interviews. Industry panels where he spoke confidently about ethics, compliance, and risk mitigation. I watched them with new eyes, noting what he emphasized, and what he avoided. Then I moved deeper. Old emails he had once asked me to review, saved automatically to shared backups. Documents he. Every collapse begins with something small. Not a scandal. Not a headline. Just a loose thread, barely visible, easily ignored. Evan had many of them. He was too successful too young, too certain that the systems around him existed to protect him rather than expose him. People like him mistake privilege for intelligence and access for immunity. I began where all truth begins. With context. Evan worked in risk management. The irony sat heavy in my chest. He was paid to identify threats, prevent exposure, and close loopholes, yet he believed he himself was beyond scrutiny. That kind of confidence doesn't come from skill alone. It comes from never having faced consequences. He was careless in small ways. He reused passwords, not identical ones, but variations of the same idea. Birthdays. Initials. Patterns only visible if you were looking closely. And I was very good at looking closely. I didn't break into anything. I didn't bypass security. I accessed what I already had the right to see. Shared devices, old family backups, cloud folders he had synced years ago and forgotten. Convenience had made him lazy. Familiarity had made him sloppy. The first thread appeared in an email. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even suspicious on its own. But the tone was wrong. Too casual. Too confident. A joke that assumed trust. A line that ended with, "just between us." Those words always matter. Then there was timing. Trades executed just minutes before public announcements. Not enough to raise alarms individually. Small margins. Small advantages. The kind that hide comfortably inside plausible deniability. But numbers tell stories if you listen long enough. I cross-referenced dates, conference schedules, private dinners, phone calls taken in hallways, messages sent late at night, phrased too carefully to be innocent. Patterns began to emerge, quietly, unmistakably. Evan wasn't reckless. He was systematic. He spread risk thin, believing it would make him invisible. He trusted complexity to protect him, never realizing that complexity leaves fingerprints everywhere. That was his mistake. Because systems don't collapse from chaos. They collapse from predictability. And once I saw the pattern, I knew exactly where to pull. I saved the file. Not as proof. Not as evidence. But as the beginning. At first, I hoped I was wrong. Not because I lacked confidence in my skills, but because once the truth is fully uncovered, there is no returning to ignorance. I checked the data again. Then again. I searched for innocent explanations, for coincidences that might soften what I was seeing. There were none. What I discovered wasn't one careless mistake or a single illegal action that could be dismissed or explained away. It was far more calculated than that. It was a system. Shell accounts layered just deep enough to avoid immediate scrutiny. Advice shared during casual family conversations that quietly shaped decisions at work. Trades placed through intermediaries who believed they were acting independently, unaware they were pieces in someone else's design. Individually, each action looked harmless. Together, they told a story. I followed the money, not emotionally, not obsessively, but with discipline. Small profits repeated again and again. Gains modest enough to stay invisible, yet consistent enough to reveal intent when placed side by side. Evan wasn't chasing massive wins. He was harvesting certainty. He knew which deals were coming before announcements were made. He knew which risks would be absorbed quietly. He knew just enough, and shared just little enough, to stay ahead without attracting attention. It was insider knowledge diluted through distance. Careful, calculated, and illegal. What unsettled me most wasn't the scale of what I uncovered. It was his comfort with it. Evan spoke confidently about ethics on public panels. He discussed responsibility in interviews. He presented himself as a guardian of integrity, while privately treating rules as inconveniences meant for less clever people. I documented everything. Dates, names, patterns. Not assumptions, facts. I built timelines the way I once built risk exposure models, watching how one decision led inevitably to the next. By the time the picture was complete, one truth stood out clearly. Evan didn't believe he was doing anything wrong. He believed he was smarter than the system. And people who believe that are always the most dangerous. Until the system finally notices them. I closed my laptop as dawn began to rise, the sky pale and unforgiving. The anger was gone. In its place was something far more dangerous. Calm. Because now I knew. And knowledge, when used correctly, cannot be undone. Evan had never known me. Not really. He thought he did, of course. He thought I was predictable, quiet, accommodating, permanently paused in life. To him, I was the woman who cooked his meals, remembered his preferences, and stayed politely out of conversations that mattered. He mistook proximity for understanding. Before this house, before this marriage, before I learned how to disappear without leaving, I had lived an entirely different life. I had negotiated with people who smiled while planning your downfall. I had sat in rooms where millions could vanish with a single misplaced word. I had learned how power actually worked. Not the loud kind, not the kind that bragged, but the kind that moved invisibly through systems and structures. I knew compliance officers by name. I knew how audits really started. I knew which questions sounded harmless and which ones made companies panic. Evan never asked about any of that. He never wondered why I stayed silent during his business monologues. Never questioned how easily I followed conversations he assumed were beyond me. He thought my lack of interruption meant ignorance. In reality, I was listening. I knew how men like Evan thought. I had worked with dozens of them. Brilliant on paper. Reckless underneath. Convinced that intelligence made them immune to consequences. They all shared the same flaw. They underestimated women who stopped performing. I didn't need access to his firm. I didn't need influence or authority. I had something far more dangerous. Context. I understood how Evan fit into the larger machine, where his confidence crossed into exposure, where his ambition created pressure points. I knew which departments cared about what, and which red flags could never be unseen once raised. And most importantly, I knew patience. Revenge, I had learned long ago, isn't about destruction. It's about alignment. You don't push the first domino. You position it so that gravity does the work. Evan had no idea that the woman he called a loser had once dismantled careers without ever raising her voice. That she knew how to let people indict themselves, slowly, thoroughly, and beyond appeal. That night, as he slept soundly under the same roof, convinced the world still belonged to him, I understood something with absolute clarity. I didn't need to expose him. All I had to do was stop protecting him from himself. And that was when I finally smiled. I didn't expose Evan. I didn't accuse him, confront him, or threaten him. That would have been messy and unnecessary. Accusations create resistance, defensiveness, noise. I wanted clarity. So instead of attacking, I held up a mirror. I compiled everything using only information that already existed. Public records. Time-stamped data. Communications he had willingly created. I didn't alter a single detail. I didn't add a word of opinion. Facts don't need decoration. I organized the information the way compliance teams prefer it. Chronological, neutral, impossible to misread. Patterns highlighted not with accusations, but with proximity. This happened here. Then this followed there. Again. And again. No conclusions. No emotional language. No fingerprints. Then I chose the right door. Every institution has one. A quiet channel designed for concerns no one wants to raise publicly. An internal ethics portal. An anonymous reporting system. A compliance inbox monitored by people trained to recognize danger when they see it. I submitted the file anonymously. Not dramatically. Not urgently. Just thoroughly. Then I stepped back. I didn't follow up. I didn't check for responses. I didn't watch for immediate consequences. Because systems like that don't explode. They grind. Slowly. Relentlessly. Without mercy or emotion. Weeks passed. Evan was still arrogant. Still confident. Still unaware. He joked about audits the way careless people always do, certain they were for someone else. But something had shifted. Emails started coming later. Phone calls were taken in closed rooms. His laughter sounded thinner, edged with irritation. He checked his phone too often. Snapped too quickly. At dinner, he barely touched his food. Work stress, Richard explained. I nodded and poured more wine. The mirror was doing its work. Once a system sees itself clearly, it cannot unsee the flaws. And when scrutiny begins, innocence is not enough. Only perfection survives. Evan had never been perfect. And for the first time, the silence in our house wasn't mine. It was his. The first sign wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, No late-night panic. Just small fractures, subtle enough that anyone who wasn't paying attention would have missed them entirely. But I noticed. Evan stopped coming home on time. Meetings ran late. Dinners were skipped with vague explanations that changed depending on who asked. His phone never left his hand, yet it seemed to bring him no comfort. He stared at the screen as if it might betray him at any moment. Confidence, once effortless, now required maintenance. At work, his schedule became unpredictable. Invitations to panels disappeared. His name stopped appearing in internal announcements. When he spoke about projects, his voice lacked its usual certainty, like someone repeating lines they no longer believed. At home, the tension followed him through the door. He snapped at waiters, corrected people unnecessarily, laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. Irritation clung to him like a second skin. One evening, he paced the living room while taking a call. "Yes, I understand," he said tightly. "No, I'm saying that wasn't material." A pause. Longer this time. "I can clarify that." Clarify. That word lingered. Richard tried to reassure him. Offered advice. Made calls to people who suddenly weren't as available as they used to be. Doors that had once opened easily now stayed politely closed. I poured tea and listened. "Everything okay at work?" I asked one night, my tone gentle, almost absent. Evan scoffed. "You wouldn't understand." I met his eyes, just for a moment. Then I looked away. The house felt different now. Quieter. Heavy with unspoken things. The silence that once belonged to me had shifted, settling squarely on Evan's shoulders. Systems had started asking questions. And questions once asked, do not stop. The cracks were still small, but they were spreading. Power doesn't vanish all at once. It retreats. Quietly. Methodically. In ways that are easy to deny. At first, Evan still left the house every morning in his tailored suit, still adjusted his tie in the mirror, still carried himself like someone important. But the rituals no longer matched the reality behind them. The first restriction came disguised as procedure. "Temporary," he said one evening, forcing a smile that never reached his eyes. "Just routine compliance stuff." His access was limited. Certain systems required approval now. Reports that once arrived automatically stopped coming altogether. His calendar, once packed weeks in advance, began to thin. Not empty. Just lighter. Then came the meetings he wasn't invited to. He noticed it when conversations ended abruptly as he approached. When doors closed just a second too quickly. When colleagues stopped speaking freely around him and started choosing their words like legal documents. He began bringing work home. Not files. Questions. He paced. Replayed conversations aloud. Argued with invisible opponents in the kitchen long after midnight. Sleep became fragmented. His confidence frayed at the edges. One morning, he didn't leave for work at all. "They've asked me to take some time," he said to Richard, staring at his coffee as if it might explain itself. "Just until things clear up." A leave of absence. In his world, that phrase carried weight. Richard tried to intervene. Made calls. Pulled favors that used to work. But influence has a shelf life, and Evans was expiring fast. I watched quietly. Not with satisfaction. Not yet. With recognition. I had seen this stage before. The moment when people realize they are no longer steering the machine, only riding it. When authority turns conditional. When confidence becomes hope. Evan avoided my gaze now. The man who had called me a loser could barely look at me at all. And for the first time since that dinner, I understood something with absolute certainty. He felt it. The ground shifting beneath him. And there was nothing he could do to stop it.